Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. I'm a little sad because I had to scrap the last recording. It just I started way too slowly. I was excited to tell you guys about my blanket because I don't normally talk about it, or I may not have before, but it's got these like maroon flowers on one side that aren't really, it's hard to say to see that they're maroon. Um and it's super soft. So I like showed the texture to the camera. And I want to do all that again, but I just want to be quicker about it. Um And it's kind of fuzzy on this side, and there's like this really complex cross stitch. And then on the other side, on the interior, it's super soft. So it's coarse on the outside, but super soft on the inside. Um, in this new lecture series, this is our second lecture series in the modern unit, if you're in my intro class. And in this one, we're going to be going over affect theory, mostly through, which is like starts with Spinoza. Um, and so we're going to start with Spinoza, but not too much Spinoza. And there are just a few pieces from different thinkers. Affect theory is my um first off, today's video probably won't be very long because I have to go teach a world religions course in about, well, I have to teach in an hour and I have to leave in about a half hour. So we'll probably keep this to around 30 to 40 minutes. Um and so what I want to do with this video is go over the guiding questions and maybe give an overview of each of the readings I want to address. If you're in my intro class, technically the syllabus only has us going over, I think, Matsumi. It's not even Spinoza. And so on the one hand, we could start there. Um, it's one of the more accessible presentations of Spinoza's thinking because it um it's an interview from 2015, so it's really recent. And versus Spinoza was from the Ethics was 1677. The Ethics was published after Spinoza passed away. Spinoza died at the age of 40, so really young. He was a lens grinder for his profession, and I guess while grinding lenses, he contemplated on philosophical rationalism and the principles of the universe. He also wrote political philosophy, and when he was young, in his early 20s, uh, he wrote his first text that was unfinished, treatise on the emendation of the intellect. Emendation in that text means correction. Um, it's an E instead of an A, so not like you can emend instead of amend. To amend with an A is like what you do to a document or the Constitution. To emend is to rectify um, or correct something mentally. And so it was a view of health and well-being that very much respected perception and relationality to the world. And like the Buddhists say, you could have all the things right, but not have the right view. You could have all the resources you need, blessings or avoidance of suffering, and the insights, if you're just not shifting it properly. Um, and so that's what an emendation is. An emendation is that perspective shift. Sometimes it's just a simple correction of fact. Like if you thought, if you, I don't know, use derivative to refer to an integration, like you use the words backwards or you get facts confused. An emendation is just correcting a fact in that regard and being like, nope, it's actually this. So that's kind of an emendation. But it can be more substantive, like a perspective shift, or transformational, like a perspective shift, or a transformation of personhood, even. transformation of the self, if there is one. Um, so that's Spinoza. The whole series, that's not all of Spinoza, obviously. Um, Spinoza was Dutch. In this series, I do want to start with our reading of Spinoza. Um, we will still do Matsumi, and I've published on affect theory on Benjamin Adorno and Spinoza. Walter Benjamin, hmm, we'll save that for the next video. I think if I explain all of these thinkers all at once, it's going to be confusing, but we'll say that our run of show, like the order we're going to do things in, is Spinoza first, and then Matsumi. So not chronological order, but in order of accessibility, but starting with Spinoza because it needs to. We're also flowing right out of Descartes. If you followed the podcast or the lecture or the intro class, any of those things, most orderings of the presentation of my content thus far have us immediately coming after Descartes. So it makes sense for us to go through Spinoza to talk about affect theory too, instead of jumping ahead to Matsumi. But I find Matsumi just to be um, the presentation of, so Spinoza presents it as a geometrical argument, much like Descartes, and Matsumi presents the information, not as much of it, but some of it in a more accessible way. Um, so I want to get the meat and I want to get different presentations of that content for my students and for listeners. Um, so we'll start with Spinoza, then we'll go to Matsumi, Brian Matsumi, Canadian philosopher, still alive. Um, we're going to read the preface there too, so you can see biographies. There's like an overview of the whole book, and it's called Politics of Affect. So it's more specifically looking at recent consequences or imports or reasons to talk about or study affect theory that are not abstract but are relevant to either political concerns or political realities, meaning either groups who need to have their voices heard for different reasons, climate catastrophe, um, which is leading to increased pressures on migration, right? Places are flooding, places are catching on fire. Um, there's, anyway, we'll talk about that. These are things that that are happening. Um, for whatever reason, these topics have become politically charged lately when they're a matter of geography, right? Demographics and migration is studied in geography. And data, for some reason, it seems like data that is unpopular or data that would lead to a contradictory conclusion to to the dominant political opinion, is seen as biased and bad science, or um, it's just becoming increasingly difficult to be intellectually self-respecting and epistemically responsible in this climate. And that's frustrating. So we will talk about those things. Um, from there, I think Mitsumi will probably be the second episode. Um, in the third episode, well, we'll probably have time in the Mitsumi episode to maybe even also cover. So it just depends on how we'll cut it. It depends on how long each thing takes for what we'll cut. But we'll then go over my article on a sort of aesthetics of affect or affective aesthetics. Um, like, yeah, in that article, it's published in the Journal of Phi Sigma Tau Dialogue, Journal of Phi Sigma Tau. Phi Sigma Tau is the International Undergraduate Honor Society. I don't even think it's undergraduate. I think it's just the International Honor Society for Philosophy. Um, I think at institutions where they have a master's program, like an explicit master's program, the chapter extends into that. They don't take publications from people with master's degrees. So even if you're working towards a PhD, you can't publish them with them if you've got your terminal MA. I published with them starting my master's program, and I submitted to them in my well, I submitted to them. I published like 10 months after I submitted, and I submitted to them while I was still an undergraduate at the University of Houston downtown. And I was accepted while I was still an undergraduate a few months later, but after, anyway, and then it was published in the fall. Um, and so I studied affect theory during a directed study with one specific faculty member at the University of Houston downtown, uh, Dr. Whitman. So big influence there. I don't think we read Spinoza the same way anymore, or I'm sure there's plenty of overlap. But I know at one point he said he wasn't a big fan of Deleuze, and um, I kind of like some of Deleuze's stuff. So, oops, he might be too. He might like, and he likes Nietzsche. Um, Wonderful professor. If you ever get a chance to take class with him or to talk to him about anything, highly recommend. As with all the faculty. At uh, Anyway, while we're here, um, so we'll go over my article third, and along the way we'll do Benjamin. Um, Walter Benjamin was a critical theorist. Oh, my article. So I guess I should explain it to you. Published, right? I told you where it was published. Told you when it was written in the context. It's for that directed study where I covered affect theory. Um, it has three sections. It was about 10 pages double space, so about 3,000 words. Um, and each section is a different philosopher's argument. In the first section, I talk about Benjamin's argument about film as um, where he praises passivity, passive reception of information or of aesthetics. And in the second section, I talk about Adorno's critique of mass music, where Adorno is in favor of the active contemplation required by more complex forms of art, whether it's a painting. Um, I I believe it was Adorno who says that the painting absorbs the viewer and the viewer absorbs like mass music. And so that's what links up the critique between the two of them. Where Adorno's critique of mass music's passivity or the listener's absorption of it might have been Benjamin that said that though. I can't remember exactly. Um, but either way, it's the reason why Benjamin's right, because Benjamin thinks that the passivity absorbed is more immediate, uh, and thus it's more powerful and useful at moments of crisis and urgency. So in any kind of political or survival action or ethical action or rescue action or something like that, what really matters is the what James calls the fighting weight, the cash value, the meat of it all, the content, right? Um, and that should be absorbed. That should be integrated so thoroughly that it might as well be passive. Sort of a Taoist principle, um, that the way shouldn't require effort. Um, I think there's certainly some velocity and acceleration and deceleration necessary to keep up with rhythms and complex rhythms, which are collaborative with other people's schedules, um, or with the rituals of institutions. But these accelerations and decelerations also should be effortless to some extent because of just the most excellence can come from that. Um, Deliberation and mastery come from things being manageable. Anyway, in the third section of that article, I reference Spinoza. And we talk about adequate and inadequate causation, inadequate and adequate. So adequate causation is something, yeah, in the second episode we'll cover Spinoza. In the third episode we'll cover Matsumi. In the fourth episode we'll cover my article. I think it'll be that way. We won't get to Spinoza this episode because there's too much to cover, but we'll cover some of the ideas. First off, affect is a notion that covers a very broad variety of things. Um, so before we jump in there, after we do my article and talking about Benjamin, basically I use Spinoza to defend Benjamin. Aside from Benjamin's own argument against Adorno about the necessity of passivity and that being a sort of Taoist defense, um, my actual argument that was published is more explicitly in lines with Spinoza's bundled causation, where the individual is considered as a bundle of all the causes that create its different effects. And my causes are not entirely contained within me. So I've had influences, like I said before, I took that directed study with Professor Whitman. Um, and so, in a sense, as we saw with other thinkers like Bergson and Aristotle, I'm expressing Professor Whitman through this class, even though we don't agree with everything, of course. I don't agree with any of my teachers about, I don't agree with it. I mean, I do and I don't, right? I interpret all of my teachers in a certain way, and in so far as I interpret them charitably, I agree with them, and in so far as my interpretation may differ from theirs, I don't agree with them. Um, but I'm still influenced in one way or another by things outside of my strict sense of self, my world, whether phenomenological or simply causal. Um, and this bundling of causation is again what Spinoza calls the individual. So going back to Bergson, elements versus parts, that's one way we talked about this idea already, that the present is an elemental expression of the past and the ways that that has been combined and interpreted um, in one's interior life, one's reflection, one's new perceptions, You notice new things and new environments and new ways that are unique to you based on your past experiences. This keeps, again, refracting and um, cascading. It's a dialectic and it's hermeneutical. Hermeneutical meaning about the interpretation or the proper method for interpreting something. Well, every perception is fundamentally hermeneutical. Descartes said it was judgment, but in fact, it is um, interpretive. You select what you see, you focus on certain things, you miss the vast majority of things. And this means that it's also polyvocal, poly meaning many or multiple, and vocal meaning, well, yeah, not, hmm, that's good. Polyvocity. Um, I was looking for the word polyvalence, but I have univocity, equivocity, and analogy on my mind from Deleuze. Going back to the previous discussion in Descartes, there was some line in one of the meditations where I said, I think this is, you can listen to the lectures if it interests you, but I wanted to follow up on that and clarify it here. Um, I don't remember the exact line in Descartes now, but actually, I think it was right at the end of the third meditation. We could probably see it's worth doing. Um, it was something about being. It was about the likeness, right? Oh yeah, we're not even on the screen share yet, so let's do screen share, and it won't be very long before I have to leave. But but the mere fact that God created me is a very strong basis for believing that I am somehow made in His image and likeness, and that I perceive that likeness, which includes the idea of God, by the same faculty which enables me to perceive myself. So yes, I think this was about equivocity, univocity, and analogy that I was thinking. I looked back at the text to get more clear on the differences between the three. Analogy is whenever, okay, so let's not start there. Analogy is like a combination of the other two. Um, Univocity means that everything is the same. Uni meaning one, and vocity meaning voice. So one voice, everything is spoken of in the same way. Um, we can use like the common substance to talk about everything, or to say that the being of the table is the same as the being of me. Now, this gets tricky for theists because they don't like to talk about, it's pretty heretical, like I was saying, to say that God is the same kind of being as me. Um, it's also pretty ridiculous, or it makes no sense to say that to some people, to say that like a dog is the same kind of being as a cat, or different taxonomies basically are the same. So we still want distinctions of some form, and so to say that univocity is true just doesn't make sense. Equivocity is when everything is different. Everything has its own register, its own voice, its own uniqueness. Now, this is just too extreme because then we can't link up sentences at all. And so analogy steps in and becomes the translation. So univocity is like everything is the same. Equivocity is like everything is different. Again, the one and the multiple, unity and difference, and or. Deleuze's solution, and then analogy is like a translation. The senses are related, but there's some kind of law of translation that happens between the two senses, or between all the senses. We can talk about God, we can talk about dogs, we can talk about um, humans and mind and all these things with different things and with similar things. Okay. Deleuze's solution instead is that the univocity of being is difference itself. And so it's a way of like injecting originary immanence into the fabric of thought. Not that's not the qualitative heterogeneity does something really similar of unity multiplicity, hyphenating without reducing to um I intentionally can't finish that sentence because to say either starts to collapse the relation that is unity multiplicity. But having the univocity be a difference or be a differentiation process, an activity of differentiation is what resolves without resolving, right? Makes it make sense without reducing, but also is manageable still. Um, okay. That's not what we're going to cover in Deleuze for Spinoza, though. We're actually going to cover a different part of Deleuze, a different seminar called The Velocities of Thought. We can read, well, while I have it up, we can read that passage where Deleuze explains these people said that being is not univocal because it's a scandal. To claim that being is said in one and the same sense of God and of the flea is a terrible thing. We must burn people like that. And then those who say being is said in several senses which have no common measure, we no longer know where we are with them. There is no order anymore. There's no longer anything. Thus, these third people said, being is neither equivocal, completely different, nor univocal. It's analogical, some mixture of completely different and all the same. And here we can say the name, the one who elaborated a theory of analogy on the basis of Aristotle, St. Thomas. I think that's Aquinas. And historically, he won. Being, which is analogical, meant yes, being is said in several senses of that of which it is said, only these senses are not without common measure. These senses are governed by relations of analogy. Thus, the equivocity of being, the univocity of being, the analogy of being, you're going to ask me where all this leads us? A couple pages further. At this point, I make a leap. Sorry, I can zoom in. At this point, I make a leap. What appears to me the strangest thought, the most difficult to think, if it has ever been thought, is univocity. Suppose someone arrives there in an assembly of priests, or even here, and says being is said absolutely in one and the same sense of everything of which it is said. One could say that this does not go very far, but this means precisely that being is univocal. That is to say, neither analogical nor equivocal. And understand well that in the Middle Ages, those sorts were very up to date on all of this, as you are. If someone happened by speaking of univocity of being, he was quickly spotted. He could pack his bags. That meant, yet again, that a chair, an animal, a man, and God are in one and the same sense. Then what? You treat God as matter? Are a dog and a man in the same sense? Quite tricky, that. Yeah. Uh, and nevertheless, there is a man, the greatest thinker of the Middle Ages, who says, yes, being is univocal. That is Duns Scotus. The story of Duns Scotus's univocal being turns out rather badly, but happily he took precautions. He said, yes, but be careful. Being is univocal insofar as it is being. That is to say that it's metaphysically univocal. He said, sure, it's analogical, which is to say that it's said in several senses physically. This is what interests me. He was at the border of heresy had he not specified metaphysically univocal and physically analogical. He would have been done for. But for Duns Scotus's disciples, less prudent than he was, it turned out badly. Because I say being is univocal, this means there is no categorical difference between the assumed senses of the word being, and being is said in one and the same sense of everything, which is. In a certain manner, this means that the tick is God, and there is no difference of category, there is no difference of substance, there is no difference of form. It becomes a mad thought. Um, so then he says it's about differences of power. Degrees of power are the only kinds of um, analogy, I think, or alternative to analogy. In other words, you will not be defined by your form, by your organs, by your organism, by your genus, or by your species. Tell me the affections of which you are capable, and I'll tell you who you are. Of what affects are you capable? It's self-evident that between a draft horse and a racehorse, the power of being affected is not the same in a fundamental way. The proof is that if you put a racehorse into the assemblage of a draft horse, it's quite likely that it'll be worn out in 3 days. I like what he says here. Let's try to imagine how Spinoza saw things. He did not see genera, species, he did not see categories, so what did he see? He saw differences of degrees of power. Nietzsche talks about power in this way as well. But affect is power, knowledge, actual change, actual causation, and imbued capacity for causation. It's a remarkably potent notion. So affect is zonal. It's affecting and being affected. Um, One instance of this, just a very brief one, is like when I start recording, sometimes my animals take a few minutes to realize that I'm not talking to them. Usually when I speak in my home by myself, it's to them. Um, so this is about the mutual reciprocity of affect. At the same time that I'm doing something, they're influencing me. And the edge of our mutual affection is indistinguishable. So from even from my perspective, though there's good arguments for an eminent out there extended world, materialist world that um, involves consciousness of its nature, which is Spinoza's argument in book one or part one. We're not going to cover part one, so we cover just a few pages from part three about causation and sorry, sometimes weird memories come back when I like almost 7 or 8 years now. Um, but yeah, that's what we'll cover from Spinoza. And then in the final episode, we might take a few pages from Professor Casey's book, Ed Casey, an old mentor of mine. Um, his 2021 book, I think it's 2021. I have it right here. 2022. Turning Emotion Inside Out, Affective Life Beyond the Subject. He has a chapter on Spinoza. And I mean, overall, the book is about affect and emotion. beyond the body, beyond the skin. Um, Deleuze similarly has Deleuze and Guattari create this assemblage or this flexible, fuzzy concept, a notion. I really avoid concept and try to use the word notion instead to talk about intuitions which map onto experiences in productive ways. Um, Not static fixed things like an essence that um, is an authority. This is very pragmatic of me because this is what truth is for pragmatists. Pragmatists say that understanding something or figuring out a truth is never a solution or like an escape from further work. It's actually a tool to do more in the future, a tool to increase your work. Uh, I kind of gone off on a tangent, gone off a lot of tangents. Um, with this mutually affecting hermeneutical edge model, right? So there's affect where we're mutually affecting each other. This affect is historical, things that have done this to me in the past, environments I've been in the past, continue to express themselves in the current moment, right? Past teachings express themselves now. Um, Past failures that I've made express themselves now because I try to avoid them typically. This was relevant to my reading of uh, Plato's tripartite soul. If you followed that lecture series, um, desire has to fail and learn the fears that courage upholds, that spirit upholds, um, through the essences attained as wisdom by insight and reason. It's a dialectical process of learning. And again, Spinoza makes clear that we always think that, I think he says this somewhere in our assigned reading from his section, but just that we think that we could have done better because we look at a mistake after the fact and we can see the contrast with how it didn't match up to our expectations. Um, and uh, that doesn't mean we could have avoided doing what we did before we saw the connections of causes and effects. Once you start to see the more intricate causes and effects and get better at predicting the outcomes, then you can avoid certain things and navigate your environment with more freedom. I've said all these things in different places. I'm trying to bring them all together. Um, I do have to leave soon. I don't think that and this meeting will take time to process before I can grab my computer and go. So I'm gonna have to let that happen. The final thing we're gonna cover in our final episode in this lecture series will be probably the we'll we'll do the Casey excerpt before we do this final one on Deleuze. And then I really like this seminar from Deleuze, and I want to read it in full to us. It's his seminars are really cool because he's just very personable. I'm sure it's a transcript. Uh, no, it was a person who transcribed these. It wasn't AI. There's the names of the people who transcribed it. But like, it starts with this, Deleuze. So what's the question? You were out of batteries? Probably talking about the recorder. So someone will lend you some. There, take some of them. So, no questions on Spinoza? Claire Parnett. No, Deleuze. I'd really like you to not to give up on your reading. How relatable is that? I mean, both as a student and as a teacher. Um, I just, 30 years, 40 years ago now, 14 before I was born. Deleuze also passed away um, a few months after I was born. He took his own life. He was very sick towards the end of his life. And when it became too painful, he um, we actually read a different Deleuze text at the very, very end of the semester called A Life, which was written at the very end of his life. He tried his best to bring all of his ideas together. Um, but right now, here at this point, we're just reading about his interpretations of Spinoza. So all of these different thinkers that I've mentioned so far, Matsumi is an affect theorist thinker influenced by Deleuze and influenced, he's well read in Whitehead. We don't cover Whitehead at all, but Whitehead is a thinker who believed that phenomena or color and sounds were out in the world. Consciousness was out in the world, even feeling was out in the world. And whenever we experience it, we get feeling or apperception, right? The perception of self, perception of perception. Well, the world does that and makes us. That's what consciousness is to Whitehead, more or less. Um, I would like to dedicate a lot of time to getting more specific about that and do a whole series, write some books about Whitehead. I think there's a lot of productive uh, work to be done there, but I'm not. That's why we don't lecture on him yet. And we'll cover this one about the philosophies of thought where he goes over Spinoza for Deleuze. Um, and then there's Matsumi, who's more recent than Deleuze, and mine, which was about 4 years after the Matsumi book came out. I didn't read Matsumi before I published my thing. I didn't read Deleuze before I published my thing. I did read Benjamin and some other critical theorists like Adorno. Um, yeah, and so affect, because of the way that it's a notion which captures affecting and being affected, my impact on others and their impact on me in the same instant at the same time. It's a metaphysical ground. It's like the most real first principle of things. Um, it's the substance of the world. It's not the substance. I mean, in Spinoza, actually, God is the substance. And God is a mind matter that we partake in. So Spinoza will say that I'm not the adequate cause of all my actions, but God, somewhere else in the big network of causation and feeling and consciousness and mind matter, is the adequate cause. So God knows the truth of everything in the big picture. And Spinoza calls this picture sospecie eternitatis from the perspective of the eternal. It's very similar to suchness and tathagata. Suchness is just like the thatness or the hiacidity of their specificness of things, their determination into specific actualized forms, or not forms, but particulars, or surfaces or iterations, depending on your reading. Um, and affect, again, is historical, it's interpretive, it is causal, it confines us, it restricts our freedoms, it also empowers us. So there's power that depresses us and limits our opportunities, our avenues for action. And then there's power that surges through us through happiness and joy and gives us new paths forward. Uh, so yeah, we'll look at all the readings for all of that. Um, and it should be a really good series. I think it'll go pretty smoothly. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy it. I find it really foundational to understanding experience. Um, if you're a student, let me know if you have questions. Put them in the comments or stay tuned. Thanks for being here. Bye, guys. I gotta go teach.